Well, it took several weeks back in December to determine the official winner, who would be the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, but it is a done deal after a recount, and the Republican, Paul Newby, is the Chief Justice of the state's highest court. Rick Henderson is editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. He's been watching not only the race closely, but what's ahead for the North Carolina Supreme Court, and he joins me now. Rick, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Donna.
First of all, why was this race for Chief Justice of the court so intensely watched, not only in North Carolina, but across the country?
There was a lot of interest in the race across the country because the Democratic Party, especially a group led by former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, poured a lot of money into these races. Holder runs a group that's trying to affect redistricting and to make sure that states that go through the redistricting process after the next census draw districts as favorable as possible to Democrats. And
so his group targeted Republican-led states.
Exactly. And they wanted to make sure that there was a Democratic Supreme Court in North Carolina, because that's almost certainly where judicial challenges to redistricting will wind up, because the U.S. Supreme Court has basically said, this is a state matter, we're not going to deal with these anymore, largely. And so what this was an effort to make sure that there were as many friendly votes for Democrats as possible on the courts. And Justice Beasley was the highest profile race because, as the chief, she does have more authority in policymaking in other areas than the associate justices do.
She was the head of the Supreme Court. She was the Democrat in the race, but she's now been defeated by the Republican Paul Newby.
That is correct. And she was there were a lot of machinations in getting her into this position because initially she was an associate justice on the Supreme Court. Her term was supposed to run out in 2022, but when Mark Martin, Republican, retired from the bench in early 2019, Governor Roy Cooper elevated Sherry Beasley to the chief's position. And what that did was that opened up her seat as an associate justice, but it also meant that she would have to defend that seat in the next general election. So it opened up two seats, and because of that, in a year that if the Democrats thought they were going to do really well, they'd have an opportunity to have all 7 seats on the Supreme Court.
Because they had 6 of the 7 at the point of the 2020 election. But now that Paul Newby is the Chief Justice, and we've had several other Republicans win seats on the Supreme Court, what's the makeup now?
It's now 4-3 Democratic, but the thing is that Newby had already announced the second Martin retired. He announced he was going to run for chief in 2020 because he was passed over, for one thing, by Cooper.
Right. A whole nother story.
A whole separate story. But nonetheless, his seat was going to be open regardless. And Democrats saw it as an opportunity to take total control of the court, and instead it completely backfired on them. I've mentioned in the story I wrote that it's been termed as an own goal by Cooper, that Governor Cooper could have at a minimum kept 2 Democrats on the court, but instead he now has only 5 Democrats on the court. Instead he has 4, and the most important one is in Republican hands, most important seat.
And by the way, you mentioned an article you wrote that's available at carolinajournal.com. So going forward, 2021, it's here, and so we have 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans sitting on the state's highest court, with Republican Paul Newby as the chief. What does the chief do? Why is that so important?
He is the chief. He's the head of the administrative office of the courts, and that's the body that sets policies and procedures for all the courts in the state. There's an administrator who he hires also, who's his choice to handle those details. The chief also assigns opinions when the Supreme Court hears a case, so who's going to write the majority-minority opinions. He also is in the role of picking the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. He picks the senior judge on the superior courts around the state. And he also selects judges for things like business court, which is a very important court in which district or superior court judges will hear cases involving questions over regulation or business disputes or things like that. And he actually selects the judges who will hear those cases. And so it's a very important role.
Fair to say then that the Chief Justice's philosophy, and we know that Republican Paul Newby's philosophy is very much about constitutional interpretation, constitutional government. making sure that you read a law essentially as it is rather
Right.
than making law, since you're a member of the judiciary, not the legislature. Fair to say that that whole philosophy is going to be reflected in all those appointments that he makes?
I would certainly say so. I also think that Justice Newby is somebody who has been in the judiciary for quite a while, and he knows the other judges. I think he will be in the position to pick people he thinks are knowledgeable and appropriate for the different positions, because they are different roles that they play. So it's not just necessarily going to be picked the people who he thinks are the most conservative on every issue for things. He's going to pick experienced judges who are going to be effective in administering the roles that they play. But also it's going to be interesting, too, because the Supreme Court has sided very tightly with Governor Roy Cooper on several separation of powers lawsuits that have been filed in recent years. And Justice Newby was on the opposite side of those majority opinions by the Democrat-led majority. And so now with two other allies, who both Tamara Berenger and Phil Berger Jr., who both ran again as constitutionalists and textualists and not as judicial activists, plus a couple of moderate Democrats on the court as well, centrist in Sam Ervin IV and in Mike Morgan. You've got possibility for some coalition building and some consensus building on this new court that almost certainly would not have existed had Chief Justice Beasley been reelected.
Rick, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected every aspect of life. What about the court system? Is there going to be a difference in the way Chief Justice Newby approaches access to courts in opposition to the way that the former Chief Justice, Sherry Beasley, approached it?
I think that's going to probably happen, and we'll probably see that fairly quickly, because one of the things that Chief Justice Beasley did immediately after she conceded was that she continued to extend a closure of the courts for another period of time, in which all actions going to be taking place virtually, electronically, with very little human interaction taking place in the courts. And so that's really, really difficult. I mean, it's almost impossible to conduct jury trials virtually, for one thing. And secondly, it does tend to slow the operation of justice. What Paul Newby has said is that he would like to see a situation in which places where there aren't major COVID outbreaks, or where the courts themselves are set up so that you can handle issues of social distancing and the like better, he would like to have those courts more open faster to the public, as long as the proper precautions are taken. And he's somebody who certainly doesn't believe in a one-size-fits-all role for the administration of justice during this pandemic. And so that's going to be one of the real noticeable things people will see, and that'll be very interesting to see how that plays out also.
We also know that he is very much a proponent of civic education. Should we anticipate that he will be out and about talking about those issues, trying to help educate the public about what the court system does?
Yes, he's very much someone who likes to make sure that people understand what the courts do, why they're there, why they do some things and not others, and what the role of a judiciary in a constitutional republic is. So I think we'll absolutely see that.